In the autumn of 1862, along the humid banks of the Savannah River in Georgia, a scandal erupted that would shatter one of the most prominent families in the antebellum South and expose the grotesque moral contradictions of a society built upon human bondage. At the Fairmont plantation, where 300 enslaved souls labored beneath the weight of cotton and cruelty, Eleanor Whitmore Fairmont, the 32-year-old mistress of the estate, gave birth to a child whose existence would unravel generations of carefully constructed respectability. The father was not Colonel James Fairmont, her husband of 14 years, but Samuel, a 28-year-old enslaved man who worked in the kitchen house and had been purchased from a Charleston auction block 7 years prior. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding South, tales that reveal the human cost of a system that reduced people to property and transformed love itself into transgression. The Fairmont estate sprawled across 2,000 acres of Georgia's richest soil, a monument to wealth accumulated through the brutal extraction of labor from black bodies. Colonel James Fairmont, 47 years old, had inherited the plantation from his father in 1848 and expanded it methodically, acquiring more land and more human beings with the cold calculation of a man who viewed both as equally tradable commodities. Educated at the College of Charleston, the colonel was a pillar of Savannah society, a deacon at First Presbyterian Church, and a man whose word carried weight in the halls of the state legislature. He wore his respectability like armor, his gray eyes perpetually measuring the world for its utility, his thin lips rarely softening into genuine warmth. He had married Eleanor Whitmore in 1848 not for love, but because her father owned the adjoining property and the union promised consolidated power. Eleanor, daughter of a prominent Augusta family, had been educated in the manner of Southern ladies, French piano needlework, and the delicate art of managing a household, while pretending not to see the violence upon which her comfort rested. She was a woman of uncommon intelligence trapped in a gilded cage, her auburn hair always properly pinned, her green eyes increasingly haunted by the gap between the Christian values she professed and the daily horrors she witnessed. The plantation itself was a carefully orchestrated theater of dominance. The great house, with its white columns and wide verandas, stood elevated on a small hill, deliberately positioned to survey the quarters where the enslaved lived in cramped, poorly ventilated cabins that reeked of sweat, wood smoke, and resignation. Beyond stretched the cotton fields, white bolls ripening under a merciless sun, each one representing countless hours of back-breaking labor under the overseer's watchful eye and ready whip. The kitchen house stood separate from the main residence, as was customary, connected by a covered walkway, a space where the enslaved prepared the elaborate meals that sustained the Fairmonts' lifestyle while subsisting themselves on cornmeal, salt pork, and whatever they could grow in their meager garden plots. This was the world into which Samuel had been thrust in 1855, purchased for $800, a price that reflected his youth's strength and the cook's assessment that he possessed an unusually refined bearing for a Negro. Samuel was an anomaly in the quarters, a man whose father had been a skilled carpenter in Charleston, and whose mother had taught him to read in secret before she was sold away when he was 12. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that infuriated the overseer, but fascinated Eleanor from the first day she saw him carrying water from the well, his movements economical and graceful, his eyes reflecting an interior life that slavery was meant to extinguish, but had somehow failed to destroy. He worked primarily in the kitchen under the supervision of Aunt Bessie, a 60-year-old woman who had cooked for 3 generations of Fairmonts, and wielded her wooden spoon with both culinary skill and as an instrument of discipline for the younger house servants. Also working in close proximity to the main house were 4 other individuals whose lives would become entangled in the scandal. Moses, a 40-year-old driver who supervised field work and served as the colonel's informant; Clara, a 24-year-old laundress, whose quick wit and observation skills made her the quarter's unofficial news source; Benjamin, a 19-year-old stable hand with a clubfoot who had been born on the plantation; and Ruth, a 16-year-old girl recently moved from field work to house service, whose innocence would not survive what was to come. The first crack in the Fairmont's marble facade appeared in the winter of 1859, though no one recognized it at the time. Eleanor had suffered 3 miscarriages in the previous decade, each loss pushing her further into a melancholy that the colonel neither understood nor attempted to comfort. He wanted an heir, not a wife's emotional well-being, and his increasing coldness drove Eleanor to seek solace in the only space where genuine human feeling seemed to exist, the kitchen house, where despite the oppression that defined their existence, the enslaved people maintained bonds of affection, humor, and mutual support that the great house lacked entirely. She began spending hours there, ostensibly supervising, but actually listening to the stories Aunt Bessie told while kneading bread, the spirituals hummed by the house servants, the fragments of fully human life that persisted in the cracks of the system designed to crush them. Samuel, with his literacy and articulateness, began answering her questions about Scripture, about the world beyond the plantation, about whether God could possibly sanction the suffering she witnessed daily. These conversations, initially conducted in the presence of others, gradually became more private, more intimate, more dangerous. Pause for a moment and reflect on the terrible irony. In a society that claimed black people lacked souls, intelligence, or capacity for refined feeling, a white woman of education and privilege found more genuine human connection with an enslaved man than with her own husband. The system that claimed to protect white womanhood instead imprisoned her in a loveless marriage, while denying the humanity of the only person who seemed to truly see her. By the spring of 1861, as the newly formed Confederacy plunged into war and the colonel joined the local militia, spending increasing time away from the plantation, Eleanor and Samuel had crossed boundaries that would have been unthinkable had they not been drawn together by their mutual imprisonment in a system that dehumanized them both, though in vastly different ways. What began as conversation evolved into emotional intimacy and eventually into physical love, conducted in stolen moments of terrifying vulnerability. Samuel understood with painful clarity that any discovery would mean his torture and death. Eleanor, sheltered by her race and class, understood the scandal, but perhaps not the full weight of the danger she had brought upon him. They met in the far storage room of the kitchen house late at night, when the rest of the household slept, or sometimes in the small cemetery at the edge of the property, among the unmarked graves of enslaved people whose names had already been forgotten. For Samuel, this was not simply desire but an assertion of his own humanity against a system that demanded his complete negation. For Eleanor, it was escape from a suffocating existence, and perhaps, though she might not have articulated it this way, an unconscious rebellion against the patriarchal order that had reduced her to decorative property. The consequences of their intimacy became undeniable in early 1862 when Eleanor realized she was pregnant. The colonel had not touched her in over a year, a fact witnessed by the house servants, and known throughout the quarters with the kind of intimate knowledge that enslaved people necessarily possessed about their enslavers' private lives. Eleanor's first response was panic, then a desperate calculation. She could not hide the pregnancy, but perhaps she could obscure its timing, claim it came from a brief reconciliation with her husband. The colonel, desperate for an heir and not particularly attentive to his wife's cycles, might be convinced. Samuel, when she told him in a whispered conversation behind the smokehouse, understood immediately that his life now hung by the thinnest thread. He offered to run, to head north and hope for survival in the chaos of wartime, but Eleanor, in a moment of both love and catastrophic selfishness, begged him to stay, promising she would protect him, a promise she had no power to keep. The pregnancy proceeded through the spring and summer of 1862, while the war raged and the colonel returned periodically, filled with martial enthusiasm and self-importance. Eleanor played her role carefully, announcing the pregnancy with demure joy, accepting her husband's gruff satisfaction, enduring the knowing looks of neighbors who calculated dates and whispered in parlors. The enslaved community watched with a mixture of dread and resignation. They had seen this story before in countless variations. Aunt Bessie, who had delivered dozens of babies both in the great house and in the quarters, knew the truth the moment she saw Eleanor's belly. Clara the laundress, who washed the sheets and knew which beds had been occupied when, had marked the timing. Moses, loyal to the colonel but possessed of enough humanity to feel conflicted, began watching Samuel with predatory attention. Benjamin, the stable hand, tried to warn Samuel without being explicit, speaking in the coded language enslaved people used to communicate danger. Young Ruth, serving meals in the dining room, felt the tension like electricity before a thunderstorm. The birth occurred on October 15th, a cool autumn evening when the cotton had been picked and the fields lay exhausted. Eleanor labored for 14 hours while Aunt Bessie and a midwife summoned from Savannah attended her. The colonel paced downstairs, drinking bourbon and accepting congratulations from neighbors who had arrived to witness this addition to the Fairmont line. When the child finally emerged and Aunt Bessie placed him in Eleanor's arms, the room fell into a silence more absolute than death. The infant's skin was pale, paler than Samuel's medium brown, but darker than Eleanor's ivory, with soft black curls and features that would only become more definitive with time but already suggested the truth. The midwife, a hardened woman who had seen every variety of antebellum scandal, met Aunt Bessie's eyes and then quickly busied herself with cleaning up, her professionalism overriding her shock. Eleanor held her son and wept, whether from joy, terror, or the full weight of what she had done, perhaps even she could not say. When the colonel entered the room an hour later, already half drunk and expecting to greet his heir, his face underwent a transformation that Aunt Bessie would later describe as watching a man's soul leave his body and something cold and violent replace it. He stood absolutely still, staring at the child, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Eleanor, propped up in her bed, pulled the infant closer to her breast and met her husband's eyes with a mixture of defiance and despair. The midwife excused herself with unseemly haste. Aunt Bessie remained, a silent witness, knowing that what happened in the next few moments would determine several people's fates. The colonel's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "Who is the father?" It was not a question but a death sentence searching for a name. Eleanor, perhaps hoping that silence might somehow save Samuel, said nothing. The colonel asked again, louder, then again, his voice rising to a roar. Still, Eleanor remained mute, cradling her child. Finally, the colonel stormed from the room, and within minutes, the entire plantation knew that something catastrophic had occurred in the great house. If you find yourself drawn into these forgotten chapters of history, these stories that illuminate the darkest corners of our past, consider subscribing to Shadows of the South, where we continue to uncover the tales that history tried to bury, the human truths that challenge our understanding of the antebellum era. The colonel spent the next 3 days conducting what he called an investigation, but what was actually a reign of terror. He questioned every enslaved person on the property, using threats, intimidation, and in some cases, physical violence. He brought in Moses as his deputy inquisitor, knowing that some enslaved people might speak more freely to another black person, not understanding that Moses would be morally conflicted about his role, but ultimately powerless to refuse. Clara was whipped for her impudent silence when she claimed to know nothing. Benjamin was locked in the barn without food for 2 days. Young Ruth, questioned alone by the colonel in his study, emerged shaking and would not speak of what was discussed, though afterward she seemed to have aged a decade overnight. Samuel continued his duties in the kitchen house with preternatural calm, preparing meals with the same care as always, his face an inscrutable mask that betrayed nothing. Aunt Bessie, when pressed, stated truthfully that she did not know who had fathered the child, though the lie of omission burned in her throat like acid. But silence could not hold against the colonel's determination and the simple mathematics of opportunity. The colonel knew his own habits, knew when he had and had not been with his wife, and the house servants' movements were documented with the obsessive control characteristic of the plantation system. By process of elimination and forced testimony extracted from terrified witnesses, the colonel arrived at Samuel's name on the 4th day. He did not confront Samuel immediately. Instead, he sent word to the sheriff in Savannah, a man named Thomas Beckworth, who was both a business associate and fellow member of the Presbyterian Church. He also summoned Dr. Cornelius Hayes, the family physician, and Reverend Abraham Foster, ostensibly to examine the child and provide spiritual counsel, but actually to serve as witnesses to the colonel's respectability in whatever came next. These men arrived on October 20th, a Thursday, and gathered in the colonel's study, while Eleanor remained confined to her room with the infant Aunt Bessie stationed outside her door, as both nurse and guard. What occurred in that study remained partially secret, but fragments emerged through various testimonies. The colonel presented his case with lawyerly precision, the timeline of his absences, the child's appearance, the process by which he had identified Samuel. Dr. Hayes examined the infant and, in the pseudo-scientific racism of the era, declared the child clearly of mixed blood, possessing Negroid characteristics. Reverend Foster, caught between his religious obligations and his social position, attempted to counsel forgiveness and discretion, suggesting that the child be quietly sent away and the matter buried to preserve the family's reputation. The sheriff, more pragmatic and violent in his instincts, advocated for Samuel's immediate execution, though he acknowledged that the legal complications, the child's existence, Eleanor's complicity, the damage to the colonel's standing if the scandal became public, created challenges. They debated Eleanor's fate as well: confinement in an asylum, divorce, or forced isolation on the plantation. Throughout these deliberations, Samuel remained in the kitchen house, aware that his hours were likely numbered, but maintaining his dignity, refusing to run and thereby confirm guilt or abandon the small community of enslaved people who had become his family. The decision, when it came, reflected the colonel's desire for revenge tempered by his need to control the narrative. Samuel would not be killed outright, as that would raise questions and potentially involve legal authorities beyond the sheriff's friendly collusion. Instead, he would be sold south to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, a fate considered tantamount to a death sentence given the brutal conditions there, but one that could be accomplished quietly through private dealers who asked no questions. Eleanor would be confined to the plantation, her child would be sent to a foundling home in Charleston under an assumed name, and the story would be managed through careful lies. The child had died shortly after birth, a tragedy that explained Eleanor's subsequent illness and seclusion. The colonel would appear the grieving father denied his heir, a sympathetic figure rather than a cuckolded fool. It was a plan born of pride, cruelty, and the antebellum South's genius for maintaining surface respectability while perpetrating unspeakable violence. But Eleanor Whitmore Fairmont, for all her privilege and sheltered upbringing, possessed reserves of will that the men underestimated. On the night of October 22nd, as arrangements were being made for Samuel's sale and the removal of her child, Eleanor took action with the only power she possessed. She told the truth. She wrote a detailed letter to her brother in Augusta, a circuit judge named William Whitmore, who had abolitionist sympathies unusual for his position and region. She described the affair, her love for Samuel, her recognition of the evil system that had created their tragedy, and her defiance of her husband's plans. She entrusted this letter to Ruth, the young house servant, with whispered instructions to take it to the postal rider who came through on Thursday mornings, bypassing the colonel's control over the plantation's correspondence. She wrote a second letter, this one to the editor of the Savannah Republican, less explicit but hinting at a scandal involving a prominent family's treatment of the enslaved and the hypocrisy of Christian slaveholders. This letter she gave to Clara, the laundress, who was scheduled to go into town that week. Finally, in an act of either courage or madness, Eleanor walked to the kitchen house that night, while the men in the study continued their plotting, found Samuel in the quarters behind it, and held him while they both wept. Pause here, and consider what this moment meant. Two people, shaped by a system that existed to keep them separate and unequal, choosing human connection over survival, knowing that their choice would destroy them both. In a world built on the negation of black humanity and the subjugation of white women to patriarchal control, their love was an act of rebellion against the very foundations of their society. It could not save them, but it asserted, however briefly, that they were both fully human, capable of choice, feeling and moral agency despite everything designed to deny those capacities. The colonel discovered his wife's absence within an hour, and what followed was a chaos that no amount of careful planning could contain. He found them in the quarters, not in any compromising position, but simply sitting side by side on a rough wooden bench, Eleanor's white hand clasped in Samuel's darker one, both of their faces marked by tears, but also by a strange serenity, the peace that comes from having finally stopped hiding. The colonel's rage was apoplectic. He struck Samuel across the face with his walking stick, then ordered Moses to chain him in the barn. He dragged Eleanor bodily back to the house, while she screamed Samuel's name, her genteel veneer finally shattered, her voice carrying across the plantation with such raw emotion that every enslaved person who heard it understood that whatever fragile equilibrium had existed was now irrevocably broken. The baby, left alone in Eleanor's room, wailed until Aunt Bessie took him, rocking him and humming a spiritual while tears ran down her weathered cheeks. But Eleanor's letters had already begun their journey. Ruth, terrified, but loyal to the mistress who had always treated her with relative kindness, delivered the first letter to the postal rider at dawn on Thursday, October 23. Clara, emboldened by Eleanor's defiance and tired of her own powerlessness, walked the letter to the newspaper office on Friday, handing it to a clerk with shaking hands before disappearing back into the anonymous streets of Savannah. William Whitmore received his sister's letter on Saturday, October 25, and immediately departed for the Fairmont plantation, arriving Sunday afternoon with 2 associates, determined to prevent whatever violence the colonel planned, and potentially to use the scandal to strike a blow against the institution he had come to view as morally abhorrent. The newspaper editor, sensing a story too explosive to ignore despite the danger of antagonizing powerful families, quietly began making inquiries, and by Monday morning, rumors were circulating through Savannah's churches and parlors. Something terrible had happened at Fairmont, involving the colonel's wife and one of their slaves, a child of mixed blood, threats of violence, whispers of love where love was forbidden. The colonel, realizing that his control of the narrative was slipping away, made increasingly desperate decisions. On Sunday evening, before William Whitmore's arrival, he had Samuel dragged from the barn and flogged with 30 lashes, less than the maximum allowed by law but enough to shred the skin on Samuel's back and leave him barely conscious. Aunt Bessie was permitted to tend his wounds, applying poultices, while whispering prayers and apologies for the world they inhabited. The colonel then summoned Reverend Foster again, demanding that he perform an emergency baptism for the infant and provide documentation of his death, even though the child was alive and healthy in Aunt Bessie's care. Foster, finally moved to moral action by the escalating horror, refused, stating that he would not participate in fraud, and would, if pressed, testify to what he had witnessed. This refusal represented a crack in the wall of respectable complicity that had enabled the system for so long, and the colonel recognized it as a dangerous development. When William Whitmore arrived with his associates, the confrontation in the colonel's study lasted 4 hours. Whitmore demanded custody of both his sister and the child, threatening to publicly expose the colonel's treatment of both if he refused. He produced evidence of the flogging, having interviewed several enslaved witnesses on the property before the colonel could prevent it. He threatened legal action, citing laws against excessive punishment, and raising questions about Samuel's sale that could potentially result in criminal charges. The colonel, trapped between his desire for revenge and his need to maintain standing, found himself negotiating rather than dictating. The compromise reached was brutal for everyone involved. Eleanor would go with her brother to Augusta,
officially for her health. Taking the infant with her, Samuel would indeed be sold, but to a buyer in Mississippi rather than Louisiana, a marginally better fate. The colonel would retain the plantation and his reputation, spreading the story that his wife had suffered a nervous collapse after childbirth and required extended care, and William Whitmore would not publish any account of the scandal or pursue legal action. It was a solution that protected white respectability while abandoning Samuel to his fate, a perfect encapsulation of how the system preserved itself by sacrificing those with no power to resist. In examining this tragedy across the span of more than a century and a half, we must resist the temptation to reduce it to a simple morality tale, or to romanticize what was fundamentally a story of destruction wrought by an evil system. Eleanor and Samuel's love, if we can call it that, was not redemptive or noble. It was human, messy, impossible, and doomed from the moment it began. Eleanor's privilege, even in her rebellion, meant she survived and retained some measure of agency, while Samuel was sold away to suffering and probable death. The system crushed them both, but not equally, a distinction that matters. Their story is not about love conquering all, but about how slavery poisoned every human relationship it touched, making genuine intimacy a form of rebellion punishable by violence, rendering even affection transgressive, transforming the most fundamental human connections into weapons deployed in maintaining racial hierarchy and patriarchal control. We study these histories not to judge individuals across the moral distance of time, but to understand how systems of oppression function, how they corrupt both the oppressed and the oppressor in different ways, how they create impossible situations where there are no good choices, only degrees of tragedy. The Fairmont scandal reveals the contradictions at the heart of antebellum Southern society, the simultaneous denial and exploitation of black humanity, the imprisonment of white women within a system that claimed to elevate them, the fundamental impossibility of maintaining moral coherence while perpetrating institutionalized violence. Every plantation concealed similar stories, some more dramatic, most more hidden, all reflecting the same truth, that slavery was not merely an economic system, but a comprehensive assault on human dignity that left no one untouched, though it ravaged some bodies and souls far more brutally than others. If these forgotten histories, these excavated truths about the foundation upon which our present was built, challenge and disturb you as they should, continue exploring these narratives, with Shadows of the South, where we remain committed to confronting the darkest chapters of American history without flinching, without sanitizing, and without forgetting. These stories demand to be told, not because they are entertaining, but because they are true, and because the reverberations of these tragedies continue to shape our world in ways we must understand, if we are ever to transcend them. The past is not past when its legacies of racial division, sexualized violence, and the intergenerational transmission of trauma remain visible in every aspect of American society. The Fairmont scandal is one story among thousands, tens of thousands, but each story contained lives, loves, sufferings, and the extinction of possibilities that should weigh on our collective conscience. Remember Thomas, the mixed-race child who never knew his parents' names. Remember Samuel, sold away and erased from history. Remember Eleanor, trapped between the world she was born into and the moral awakening that destroyed her. Remember all the unnamed enslaved people at Fairmont, whose own stories were never recorded, but who witnessed, endured, and survived the daily cruelties of a system that America preferred, for far too long, to forget rather than confront.